They tried to ruin him. They threatened the people he cared about. They laughed at him in the courtroom. But what they did not know was that the old janitor holding a mop had a secret that would bring their massive, rotten empire crashing down. This is the true story of how James Wilson, one invisible man, defeated the most powerful people in America. His name was James Wilson. He was 67 years old. For 28 years, he had been invisible, cleaning the floors and emptying the trash cans of the Grand Federal Courthouse. But tucked away in his wallet, behind a faded picture of his late wife, was a valid license to practice law. To get to know each other better, leave your name and the city where you are watching this video in the comments. On this particular morning, Courtroom 405 was packed. Everyone had come to witness what the newspapers called the trial of the century. The defendant was Daniel Cooper, a real estate developer facing charges that he had stolen technology worth $8 billion, a system designed to give free electricity to poor families. Powerful people wanted his company, Green Haven Communities, shut down and taken away. Judge Margaret Foster looked down from her high bench. Daniel Cooper sat alone at the defense table. His highly paid legal team, a group of 6 lawyers who charged thousands of dollars per hour, simply did not show up. No call, no explanation, nothing. The judge looked down sharply. "Mr. Cooper," she asked, her voice cold, "where is your legal team?" Daniel stood up slowly, his hands shaking. "I do not know, Your Honor. They were here." "I do not know, Your Honor. They were here," Daniel Cooper repeated, looking desperate, running a hand through his expensive but messy hair. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized he was standing alone on a crumbling cliff edge. Judge Foster's sharp, serious gaze traveled over the room, settling on the empty chairs at the defense table. Her disapproval was heavy. To her, the absence of a top legal team signaled either cowardice or an obvious lack of merit in the defense. She lifted her gavel slowly, preparing to rule that the defendant had defaulted, handing the massive corporation a swift, silent victory. Just as the gavel began to descend, a noise cut through the tense silence of the court. It was a simple sound, the quiet squeak of rubber soles on the polished marble floor. Everyone in the packed courtroom turned their heads toward the back entrance, near the janitor's closet. A man in a faded, loose blue jumpsuit, holding a long mop handle and an empty metal bucket, stepped out of the shadows. It was James Wilson. James walked slowly, his body stiff, his shoulders held high despite the age and the years of scrubbing floors. He walked past the railing that separated the public seats from the floor of the court. He stopped right behind Daniel Cooper, who turned around, bewildered, recognizing the man who often quietly cleaned his table after a long day of meetings. Judge Foster stared down, her face hard and unmoving. Her lips drew into a thin, tight line. "Mr. Wilson," she said, her voice dripping with irritation, "court is in session. Please return to your duties outside." "Oh." James placed his mop and bucket carefully against the wall. He did not look up at the judge. He spoke to the room, his voice raspy from disuse, but carrying an unmistakable authority that cut through the judicial formality. "If the court will allow," James said simply, "I am here to represent Mr. Cooper." A wave of shocked murmurs swept through the gallery. The prosecutors, a team led by the smooth and highly confident Christine Harris, exchanged amused, condescending glances. Judge Foster leaned forward, fixing James with a skeptical look that dismissed his every visible feature. The worn uniform, the tired eyes, the faint smell of bleach. "You are not listed as counsel, Mr. Wilson. You are an employee of the courthouse cleaning service." James reached into the side pocket of his jumpsuit. He pulled out a worn, tri-fold wallet. From the wallet, he produced a laminated card. It was yellowed and cracked at the edges, clearly 30 years old, but perfectly legible. He handed it to the bailiff. "James Wilson, Esquire," he stated clearly. "Active status, Illinois State. Bar number 200495. I am retained counsel for the defense of Daniel Cooper. The bailiff, a young woman named Sarah, blinked twice. She took the card and, still unsure, walked toward the judge's bench. Judge Foster snatched the card almost aggressively. She examined it under the high court lights. Her eyes narrowed as she read the name and the date. It was valid, active, completely in order. A deep silence fell over courtroom 405. The defense counsel for the $8 billion case was a 67-year-old janitor. Judge Foster looked up again, her face betraying no emotion, though inside she felt a surge of professional outrage. This was not proper. This was not the kind of respect a case of this magnitude deserved. She paused for a full minute, allowing the silence to settle. "Mr. Wilson," she finally addressed him, using his last name for the first time. "I see this license is technically active. However, your last legal practice registration date is decades ago. When was the last time you argued a motion in federal court?" James did not hesitate. 30 years ago, Your Honor." The judge frowned. "And you expect this court to believe you are competent to handle one of the most complex corporate fraud cases this year? A case involving billions of dollars in highly technical clean energy technology. I expect the court to recognize my standing as an officer of the court and allow the defendant his constitutional right to counsel." James countered, his tone calm and respectful, hitting the necessary legal points simply and directly. "I have reviewed the files, the documents, and the case history. I am ready to begin." After a long, uncomfortable silence, Judge Foster sighed, a sound that conveyed her profound disapproval. She slammed the valid bar card down on the bench. "Fine," she spat out the word. "The court will allow James Wilson to appear as temporary counsel for the defense. Mr. Cooper, understand this. This is a temporary allowance. Any disrespect shown to the court, any lack of preparation, or any disruption of decorum will result in immediate disbarment from this case." She looked directly at James. "Are we clear, Mr. Wilson?" "We are clear, Your Honor," James confirmed. The judge quickly postponed the opening arguments until the next morning, needing time to compose herself and for the shock in the courtroom to subside. The minute the gavel struck and the judge retired to her chambers, the courtroom erupted in frantic whispers. Daniel Cooper sat utterly still, trying to process the sudden appearance of his new, completely unexpected lawyer. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the marble halls, James walked Daniel out of the courthouse. The day's noise had quieted down, replaced by the hushed movements of the evening staff. "James," Daniel began, running his hands over his face, "I don't know what to say. Those lawyers, they just vanished. It feels impossible." James stopped near the grand oak doors. He looked past Daniel, out at the busy Chicago street life. His face was tired, but his eyes were sharp. He leaned in close to Daniel, dropping the respectful tone he used in court. His voice was low and gravelly, a quiet, serious warning. "Listen to me, Mr. Cooper. Nothing about this is bad luck or coincidence. 6 highly paid lawyers do not miss a trial of this magnitude, not without reason. Someone paid them a lot of money to disappear and leave you stranded. This entire thing feels like a setup." Daniel stared at him, his idealism finally cracking under the weight of the day's events. "A setup? But why? Who?" "The people who wanted your company," James stated. "The people who do not want free electricity disrupting their trillions of dollars in profit. They wanted you to lose by default this morning, before you could even present a defense." James looked him up and down. "You need to understand something right now. We are not fighting a lawsuit. We are fighting a war. And they just showed us how they operate." He told Daniel to go home, secure his house, and wait for his call. He had to prepare the case. That night, James returned to his small, humble apartment on the South Side. The physical exhaustion of being back in the legal spotlight after 3 decades was already setting in. His hands felt stiff, and a dull, hammering pressure was building behind his eyes, the familiar sign of rising blood pressure, always triggered by stress and confrontation. He did not know it, but he was no longer invisible. 2 blocks away, parked in a dark, empty street, a black sedan sat idle. Inside, 2 men watched James's apartment building through thermal imaging cameras. They recorded his quiet movements, noting the precise location of his apartment and the minimal, worn-out furniture visible through the thin blinds. "He's the janitor," the man in the driver's seat reported into a thin headset. "James Wilson. He's the one who stepped up in court." "Affirmative," the voice on the other end, cold and professional, responded instantly. "Find out everything. Who is he talking to? Where does he go? And especially, find out about his daughter. We need leverage immediately. We cannot allow this distraction to continue." The video of the judge granting him temporary counsel is already circulating, and the alliance does not appreciate being made to look foolish by a man in a blue jumpsuit. The men in the car settled in, the camera clicking softly as it captured every movement James made within his small, confined space. The danger was no longer abstract. It was real, it was watching, and it had a specific plan for the old janitor who dared to step back into the light. The first day of the trial against Daniel Cooper's Greenhaven communities began with a suffocating formality. James Wilson sat at the defense table, his one good suit feeling tight and strange after decades of wearing a janitor's uniform. Judge Margaret Foster looked down from her high bench, her expression a mix of professional neutrality and clear personal distaste. Every time her eyes rested on James, he could feel the silent judgment. This man did not belong here. The opposing counsel, Christine Harris, a woman with a tailored black suit and a voice engineered for authority, called her first technical witness, Dr. Bradford. The doctor was an expert in corporate financial modeling and began a long, complex presentation involving slides and graphs that detailed how Daniel Cooper's geothermal technology was financially unsound, dangerously risky, and based on unrealistic market projections. The testimony was intentionally confusing, designed to overwhelm the jury with big numbers and complex terms. James waited patiently, letting Dr. Bradford speak for nearly an hour. When it was James's turn to cross-examine, he walked slowly to the lectern, ignoring the stiffness in his back. He did not ask about the financial models. He did not ask about the market projections. "Dr. Bradford," James said, his voice deep but quiet, forcing the courtroom to lean in. "In your report, you state that you traveled to Texas on July 4th to analyze the primary drilling site, correct?" The expert, caught off guard by the simplicity, nodded. "That is correct. And you testified that you spent 3 days there compiling the necessary field data for your report?" "Yes." James picked up a single sheet of paper from his table. It was a flight itinerary. "I have here the record of your private corporate flight, chartered by Midwest Energy, arriving in Dallas on the evening of July 6th. He paused, looking directly at the jury. "Dr. Bradford, if you arrived on the evening of the 6th, how did you manage to spend 3 days in Texas, starting on the 4th? Dr. Bradford's face instantly flushed crimson. He stammered, trying to recall dates, trying to reconcile the lie with the hard truth. "It must be a clerical error," the doctor mumbled, wiping his forehead. "A 3-day error, doctor," James pressed, not raising his voice, just stating the fact. "Your entire financial analysis is based on 3 days of field data you could not possibly have collected because you were not there. Your testimony, sir, is not an analysis. It is a theory based on numbers you were given, not numbers you found." James looked back at Judge Foster, who was trying hard to maintain her neutral expression, but a flicker of grudging respect crossed her face. James returned to his seat, having utterly dismantled the main pillar of the prosecution's technical case, with one simple, undeniable fact: the plain schedule. The stress of the performance, however, hit him instantly. Back at the table, James's hands were shaking slightly. His chest felt tight, a familiar, unwelcome pressure that signaled his high blood pressure was spiking. He took a long, slow breath, trying to calm the sudden, sharp resentment that rose up, the injustice that had forced him to waste 30 years before he could stand here and do this simple, right thing again. He ignored the pain and focused on the next phase. When court adjourned for the day, James left the courthouse by a side door, needing air. He walked quickly down a narrow alleyway connecting two large buildings, heading toward the subway station. The alley smelled of stale rain and exhaust fumes. He heard the footsteps behind him, not hurried, but deliberate. Two men blocked the exit ahead of him, the same two men who had been watching his apartment the previous night. They were big, dressed in cheap, generic business clothes, and they moved with a dangerous, professional stillness. "Mr. Wilson," the taller one said, his voice flat, "we need to have a quick chat about your recent career change." James stopped, keeping his hands open and visible. He felt the rapid pounding in his chest. "I don't know who you are." "Oh, you know who we are," the other man scoffed. "We are the people who manage distractions, and you, James, are a very inconvenient distraction." The taller man stepped closer, his shadow falling over James. "That testimony today? Very impressive. A simple trick, but effective. You're good, James. Too good for a janitor." James stayed silent. "You have a nice, small life," the man continued, lowering his voice. "A little apartment on the south side. A simple routine. We know everything about that routine. Where you buy coffee. The one small bottle of medicine you hide in the cupboard." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "We know your daughter, Lauren Wilson. We know where she works. We know she's trying to get that big promotion next month." The mention of Lauren hit James like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. His blood pressure surged, roaring in his ears. This was not about documents. This was leverage. "Leave her out of this," James managed, the words scraping his throat. The thug smiled, a cold, humorless action. "That's up to you, James. You walk away from Daniel Cooper's defense right now. Go back to your mop and your floor wax. If you forget this whole thing happened, we forget about your daughter's job and your nice little apartment. If you press this case, well, things get complicated. Lauren might find herself in some difficult situations at work, very difficult situations, and that little apartment might catch fire." The thug lightly patted James's shoulder, then stepped back. "We'll be watching. We always are." The two men walked away, disappearing around the corner, leaving James alone, leaning against the cold brick wall, trying to regain control of his breathing. The pain in his chest was sharper now, a tight fist squeezing his heart. He pulled out the small bottle of pills from his inner coat pocket and shook out two, swallowing them dry. He knew the threats were not empty. The alliance was not a business. It was a machine of destruction, and he had put his daughter directly in its gears. Later that evening, James was finally back in his apartment. The 4 rooms felt small and safe, a necessary refuge from the polished terror of the courtroom and the alley. The windows were shut against the city noise, and the evening news was running softly on the small television. He was too exhausted to eat, instead collapsing onto his worn couch. He pulled out his old, cheap flip phone and stared at Lauren's number. He desperately needed to call her, to warn her, to tell her to quit her job and disappear for a week, but he hesitated. Calling her would confirm the truth of the threat. She would panic, and she would blame him, confirming all the bitterness that had driven them apart. He decided to wait, just until he had a clearer plan, focusing first on securing his home. He stood up, stretching his aching muscles, and began a slow, systematic check of the apartment, a habit ingrained from years of working security. Everything seemed normal, dusty, and crowded with his few belongings. But as he reached the small desk where he kept his legal notes, he noticed something wrong. The spine of his old legal encyclopedia, a massive, heavy volume, was slightly crooked. He was meticulous about keeping that desk clean. He pulled the book down. Nothing. He checked the small locked box where he kept his grandfather's watch. Still locked. He moved to the small utility closet near the kitchen, where he stored cleaning supplies and old, useless paper files from his disgraced career. He paused before the closet door. The latch was slightly scratched. He opened it slowly. The files were pulled out, scattered haphazardly on the floor, mostly worthless documents relating to maintenance schedules and old invoices. But deep in the back, where he had shoved the box 30 years ago, he found the file labeled simply, Windsor and Cross, Internal Review. Someone had opened the box. Someone had been digging. He picked up the file and flipped through the thin, yellowed paper copies of the investigation that had destroyed his life. The fabricated evidence tampering charges. The internal firm memo that had condemned him. As he looked closer at the pages, he noticed small, faint red check marks next to specific lines of text detailing the supposed dates of his illegal actions. They weren't just threatening him, they were building a narrative. They were preparing to use his past disgrace in court to destroy his credibility and the entire case. James felt the overwhelming dizziness return, worse this time. He pressed his hand against the wall to steady himself. This was not a warning. It was active preparation for attack. He flipped the last page of the file, and tucked between the final pages was a fresh piece of glossy paper, folded neatly. It was a photograph. James snatched it up, his breath catching in his throat. It was a picture of Lauren. She was sitting at an outdoor cafe table, laughing, her head thrown back, talking on her cell phone. The picture was clear, taken from across the street. It was recent. Underneath the photo, written in a bold black marker, was a single chilling message. Don't let history repeat itself, James. His hands were shaking violently now, and he dropped the file. He stumbled back a step, knocking over a stack of old newspapers. The noise sounded deafening in the silence of the room. He needed to get out. He needed to call her. He needed to move. Before he could reach the phone, a muffled sound came from the outside hallway. A faint scraping noise, followed by the undeniable sound of a door being gently pried open across the hall. James froze, gripping the framed photo of his daughter. They weren't just watching anymore. They were coming for him. He heard a low whisper, then heavy footsteps moving slowly toward his door. He looked wildly around the small room. There was nowhere to hide. He moved silently, his 67-year-old body protesting every motion, heading for the kitchen drawer where he kept a heavy flashlight for emergencies. He reached the counter, his fingers closing around the cold metal just as a heavy, rhythmic pounding began on his front door, shaking the very frame. "James Wilson! We know you're in there!" A deep voice roared from the hallway. "Open the door now!" The heavy, rhythmic pounding began again, more insistent this time. James Wilson, 67 years old, felt the sharp electric spike of adrenaline mixed with the dull, hot pressure of his high blood pressure. He knew he could not fight two men, possibly three, who were younger and stronger, and who were likely armed. He was standing on the precipice of losing not just the case, but his life, in this tiny, poorly lit kitchen. The flashlight felt inadequate, a poor substitute for the legal arguments he preferred to wield. The men outside weren't interested in due process. He heard a metallic crunch as they put a tool, likely a crowbar, into the gap between the frame and the door. The sound of wood fibers tearing was sickeningly loud. James abandoned the front entrance. He lunged toward the back window over the sink, his movements rusty but driven by panic. He fumbled with the old lock, cursing under his breath. The window squealed loudly in protest as he finally managed to lift the sash, a sound that surely alerted the intruders to his escape attempt. A deep shout came from the hall. "He's in the back! Get around!" James didn't wait. He forced his narrow frame out onto the rusted metal rungs of the fire escape. The cool night air hit his face, smelling faintly of car exhaust and cooking grease. He moved down the rickety stairs quickly, gripping the railings so tightly his knuckles turned white. He reached the bottom landing, jumped the final 3 feet onto the cracked pavement of the alley, and started running. He did not look back. He ran until the alley opened into a side street, and he found himself gasping, hands braced on his knees, lungs burning. The pain in his chest was sharp, but he ignored it. Survival was the only priority. He walked for hours, a man without a destination, eventually settling in a run-down, anonymous motel several blocks from the courthouse. He paid cash and tried to sleep, the images of splintered wood and menacing shadows playing behind his eyelids. When James stepped out the next morning, the city felt indifferent, cold. He needed his files, his suit, his notes, all left behind in the apartment he had just fled. He took the bus back to the south side, feeling the inevitable pull toward disaster. When he reached his block, the smell hit him first. The acrid, lingering odor of smoke and wet, burnt things. He pushed past the caution tape and the handful of onlookers. His building was a wreck. A fire truck was still parked down the street, its lights flashing silently. His apartment, the small second-floor unit that had been his only refuge for 3 decades, was gone. The windows were black, gaping holes in the brick structure. The roof sagged heavily over what used to be his bedroom. Ash and water had destroyed everything. They had ransacked it first, looking for Daniel Cooper's files, and when they didn't find them, they had made sure James would have nothing left to return to. They hadn't just threatened him. They had erased his physical life. He stood there for a long moment, feeling hollowed out, staring at the ruin of his home. It was the same feeling he had 30 years ago when the judge's ruling had stolen his career. A total, complete helplessness against the indifference of overwhelming power. The small, cheap cell phone in his pocket vibrated. It was Lauren. James answered, his voice thick with smoke and exhaustion. "Hello. Dad. What happened?" Lauren's voice was high, tight with panic and a furious edge he recognized. "I just saw it on the local news ticker. Is that your building? Are you hurt?" "I am fine, Lauren," he confirmed, trying to keep his tone level. "I wasn't there. They set the fire, didn't they? They were sending a message." She didn't wait for him to answer. "You have to tell the police. You have to tell the judge about the threats." "And tell them what? That the Alliance, the same people who control the energy supply for half the country, are playing arsonist? No one will believe me, Lauren. They will say I did it myself for insurance money." James rubbed his forehead, the pressure building behind his eyes. There was a silence on her end, a silence that usually meant she was pulling away in disapproval. But this time, when she spoke, her voice was hard, focused, and laced with a fresh, sharp bitterness. "They just fired me, Dad." James froze, standing on the curb opposite the smoking wreck of his life. "What? What are you talking about?" "My boss called me 10 minutes ago," she repeated, the words clipped and precise. They cited unavoidable controversy and misalignment with corporate values. They said the firm cannot be associated with a public figure facing an arson investigation. "They fired me, Dad, because of this trial, because of you." The news landed like a physical blow, worse than the fear of the flames. They hadn't just hurt him. They had reached out and struck the one person he was trying desperately to keep safe. "Lauren, I am so sorry," he managed. "Don't be," she cut in, her tone changing completely, shedding the shame and embracing defiance. "They want to bury you, but they just made a huge mistake. Now I have time, Dad. I have nothing but time and a lot of anger. Lauren, this is dangerous. You need to stay away," James insisted, his voice weakening as the reality of her involvement sank in. "Too late for that, James," she said, using his first name, the sign of a serious, businesslike conversation. "I have access to my work files for the rest of the day, before they cut my credentials. I was working in digital forensics for 2 years before switching to communications. I know how to find things the public doesn't see." James took a slow, deep breath, tasting the dust in the air. He realized that the Alliance's aggressive move, meant to isolate and break him, had instead pushed his most capable but estranged ally directly into the fight. "What are you looking at right now?" James asked, abandoning the argument. "I pulled up the records on the Shell Corporation's financing Midwest Energy's legal team," Lauren responded immediately. Her voice crackled with professional energy. "It's a nightmare map of subsidiaries, but I found something strange. Someone has been accessing the old files, the sealed case records from 1994. James felt a terrible, cold certainty settle over him. They weren't just attacking the present case. They were preparing to destroy his reputation, his credibility, and his entire life again. "They're digging up the disbarment," James whispered. "Worse than that," Lauren said, her voice dropping. "They aren't just accessing your old evidence tampering charges. They are pulling every court transcript, every sworn testimony, every single piece of evidence related to the discrimination suit you filed against Robert Sinclair's company 30 years ago. They are building a narrative, Dad. They plan to use your past to paint Daniel Cooper as a naive victim being misled by a vengeful, disgruntled, and unethical former attorney. And I just saw the name of the law firm accessing those files." "Who?" James demanded. The pressure behind his eyes was unbearable now. "Windsor and Cross," she whispered. "Your old firm. The same people who manufactured the evidence against you." James felt the cold spike of recognition, a 30-year chill running through his chest. Windsor and Cross. The very place where he had started his promising career, the place that had engineered his downfall, was now working to finish the job. They were not just trying to win the case. They were trying to erase the last vestiges of James Wilson's reputation. He did not have time for anger. The pressure of the moment, the need to act, to protect Daniel Cooper, overrode the searing resentment. He took a long, shaking breath. His doctor's warning about his blood pressure felt meaningless now. If he failed here, the health risks would be the least of his worries. The entire geothermal project, the future of free energy, and the survival of the truth would be lost. The next morning, the air in courtroom 405 was thick and heavy, smelling faintly of old wood and new conflict. It was the final day of testimony. James stood at the defense table, his 67-year-old body held straight by sheer will. He wore the same dark, ill-fitting suit, a stark contrast to the perfectly tailored outfit worn by the legendary William Thornton, who sat opposite him. Robert Sinclair, the CEO of Midwest Energy, occupied a front-row seat, his expression a mask of smug anticipation. Judge Foster maintained a strict, cold watch from the bench, but even she seemed to sense the immense pressure. James looked over at Daniel Cooper, who nodded, his face pale but resolute. Beside Daniel, Lauren sat, her posture stiff, clutching a single small flash drive. This was the physical repository of the truth, Thomas Cooper's documented betrayal, and the video of the conspirators' secret meeting. "The defense calls its final witness," James announced, his voice steady. "Daniel Cooper." The presentation was swift, focused, and emotionally charged. Daniel explained the technology, his vision, and, under James's gentle but firm questioning, the devastating realization of the corporate alliance against him. Thornton's cross-examination was brutal, attempting to paint Daniel as reckless, naive, and ultimately a fraud relying on the advice of a disgraced former attorney. "And now, Your Honor," James stated, stepping back up to the podium once Daniel was excused, "the defense would like to introduce one final piece of evidence, which we believe conclusively demonstrates the malicious intent and corporate collusion intended to destroy Green Haven communities and steal its proprietary technology." He motioned to Lauren, who rose and walked toward him, holding the small flash drive securely in her hand. "Counsel," Judge Foster interrupted, her voice a warning rumble, "you have presented extensive evidence already. What is the nature of this final piece?" "It is a video recording, Your Honor, confirming the direct involvement of the plaintiffs in organizing a criminal conspiracy with numerous unnamed entities, including senior members of the legal team," James replied, looking directly at Thornton, who suddenly seemed to lose some color in his face. Sinclair, too, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I object, Your Honor," Thornton roared, leaping to his feet. "This is a baseless claim. The defense has had weeks to present evidence. We cannot allow video evidence, potentially tampered with or fabricated, at this late stage of the proceedings. We can establish chain of custody, Your Honor. The video speaks for itself," James countered simply. He took the flash drive from Lauren. It felt light, yet carried the weight of everything he had fought for. Judge Foster studied James. She saw not the courthouse janitor, but the skilled, relentless advocate he once was, and perhaps still was. "The court will review the relevance of the evidence privately before presenting it to the jury. Hand the drive to the clerk, Mr. Wilson." As James turned to hand the drive over, the tranquility of the courtroom was violently shattered. A loud, sharp noise, like heavy wood splintering, echoed from the back doors. Before anyone could process the sound, 4 men, dressed in matching dark tactical gear, burst through the entrance. They moved with terrifying speed and coordination, their faces obscured by dark balaclavas. They were not police. They were professional contractors, private military. The courtroom erupted into instant chaos. Shouts and screams blended with the scraping of chairs as the jury and spectators ducked for cover. Sinclair stood frozen, his face finally revealing true panic, not smugness. "The flash drive!" one of the mercenaries yelled, his voice muffled but clear, pointing directly at James. The 4 men converged on the defense table. Judge Foster hammered her gavel furiously, demanding order, but her authority evaporated instantly against this violent intrusion. James knew exactly what was happening. This was the Alliance's final, desperate move. If the evidence was destroyed or stolen now, they would win everything. Without hesitation, James spun around, pushing Lauren toward Daniel and shouting, "Get down! Protect yourself!" He clutched the flash drive tightly in his right hand. Instead of running, he used his own body, old, tired, and fragile, as a shield. He drove his elbow back toward the attackers and slammed the flash drive into the small, inner-zippered pocket of his suit jacket. The nearest mercenary reached him first, a massive man whose gloved hand grabbed James's shoulder and violently wrenched him away from the podium. James felt a searing pain shoot down his arm as he was thrown hard against the defense table. The air rushed out of his lungs. The other 3 men surrounded him instantly, ignoring the scattering lawyers and the terrified courtroom staff. They were focused solely on the target. James struggled, his vision blurring from the impact and the sudden, overwhelming stress. He fought against the grip, his mind screaming at him to protect the evidence. "Where is it, old man?" the first mercenary snarled, his voice inches from James's ear. He started patting James down roughly, searching for the small device. James kept his right arm pressed tight against his chest, shielding the pocket. He tried to speak, but only a desperate gasp escaped his lips. He felt the cold, hard steel of a short baton connect sharply with his side, immediately followed by the agonizing realization of broken ribs. He sagged, biting back a cry of pain. As he collapsed toward the floor, he heard Lauren screaming his name. Through the haze of pain, he saw Daniel scrambling to protect her. One of the men ripped James's jacket open, finding the zippered pocket. James used the last bit of his strength, twisting his body and digging his fingernails into the man's wrist. It was a futile gesture, but it bought a fraction of a second. The mercenary struck James again, a blow to the head that sent brilliant white light flashing behind his eyes. James fell fully to the hard marble floor, the noise muffled and distant. The mercenary knelt, pulling the zipper down. His fingers closed around the smooth plastic shell of the flash drive. He yanked it free, just as James stretched his hand one last, desperate time toward the escaping evidence. Suddenly, a loud, clear voice cut through the violence. "Stop! United States Marshals! Drop your weapons!" The mercenaries paused, looking toward the far side of the room. This was the moment of decision. Escape with the evidence or confront law enforcement. The man holding the flash drive looked down at the barely conscious, bleeding James Wilson, then back toward the approaching sound of armed reinforcement. He had the prize. He tucked the drive into his own gear and turned to run, leaving James crumpled on the floor of courtroom 405, blood beginning to stain the immaculate marble. James lay still, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, the pain a distant, unbearable roar, knowing only that the evidence, the only weapon they had, was gone. The heavy steel doors of courtroom 405 burst open, not with the sound of retreating mercenaries, but with the organized, authoritative shout of U.S. Marshals and federal security personnel. They flooded the space, guns drawn, quickly securing the perimeter and the remaining civilians. The attack had been precise and swift. The gunmen were already gone, vanishing into the labyrinthine hallways of the massive building. The air hung still and chemical, thick with the metallic scent of copper and the sharp, bitter smell of gunpowder. James did not move. He lay crumpled on the slick, cold marble, the impact of the blow still echoing in his ribs and skull. A feeling of icy, sinking dread, far worse than the pain of his broken body, seized him. They had won the physical skirmish, yes, proving their desperation, but James knew with devastating certainty that they had lost the entire war. The evidence was gone. A frantic, high-pitched scream cut through the ringing in his ears. It was Lauren. "Dad! James!" He tried to lift his arm, a simple gesture to show he was still conscious, but the world tilted violently. A deep, wet cough racked his chest, and the bitter taste of blood welled in his mouth. Daniel Cooper dropped beside him, ignoring the security guards demanding he move back. Daniel's face was chalk white, his eyes wide and vacant, as he stared at the spot where the mercenary had stood moments before. "They took it, James. They took the drive," Daniel whispered, his voice shaking with profound devastation. "It was all for nothing. All this sacrifice." James focused on the ceiling, the sound of boots shuffling across the broken glass and overturned furniture becoming a dull hum. He closed his eyes. 30 years of waiting, 3 weeks of grueling, physical combat, an injured body, and the core truth, the entire weight of the proof, was now safely in the hands of the very corporation it was meant to condemn. Judge Margaret Foster, though visibly shaken and protected by a marshal, maintained an impressive command of the court. She stood, demanding order and directing the lockdown. She then approached James, her expensive black robe sweeping across the dusty floor. "Mr. Wilson," she said, her voice strained, reflecting the shock. yet firm. She ignored the attempts of the security personnel to keep her away from the injured man. Did they take the only copy of the video? James struggled to draw a full breath, the air burning in his lungs. He opened his mouth, trying to articulate the word no, but only a wet, desperate rattle escaped. He managed to shake his head once, a tiny, subtle motion that might have been mistaken for a twitch. He was trying to communicate something vital, but the agony was overwhelming, making coherent thought impossible. Lauren pushed past Daniel, falling to her knees on the opposite side. Her face was streaked with tears, but her mind was operating in crisis mode, focused and technical. "The documentation," she insisted, checking his pupils, then his pulse. "The supporting files, the hard copy chain of custody. Did they take those too?" James weakly tried to point, his trembling fingers curling toward the defense table that lay on its side, a massive oak shield. Daniel immediately understood and scrambled to the overturned table. Half hidden by the thick folds of the tablecloth was the scuffed leather briefcase James always carried. Daniel pulled it out. It was intact, still locked. "The papers are here," Daniel confirmed, holding the case tightly against his chest. "It is not enough," Lauren choked out, leaning her head briefly against her father's shoulder, a raw, uncontrolled sob escaping her before she pulled back, returning to her immediate task. The video was the key, the irrefutable visual proof of Thomas's involvement, the CEO meeting, the whole thing. The medical team arrived, moving with practiced efficiency. They strapped James onto a rigid backboard. The motion caused a searing, blinding flare of pain that started in his ribs and shot directly to the back of his eyes. As they prepared to lift him, his eyes met Judge Foster's one last time. "Judge," he managed to gasp out, his voice thin and dry. "The meeting, the evidence, they knew where we kept it. They had to know everything." Foster nodded slowly, gravely, understanding the chilling implication. The attack was not just about stealing the evidence. It was confirmation of an inside leak, a deep betrayal far wider than Thomas Cooper. The Alliance had eyes and ears within their closest circle, perhaps even within the courthouse itself. As James was carefully wheeled out of the room, past the stunned, silent jury huddled in their box, he focused his gaze on the public gallery. Most spectators were hiding or being questioned by the marshals. But there was one man, sitting near the rear exit, impeccably dressed in a standard gray suit, who had remained calm and completely untouched by the violence. The man caught James's eye and offered the smallest, most controlled smile, a smile of cold, complete victory. That sight, combined with the crushing awareness of defeat, sent a familiar, agonizing wave through James's chest. His high blood pressure surged, seizing him, a tight, painful band constricting his heart. The doors of Courtroom 405 swung shut behind him, closing him off from the legal fray, leaving the truth about the Alliance and the fate of Daniel Cooper resting only on scattered paper documents and the resilience of a defeated, bleeding old janitor. The rush to the emergency room was a blur of fluorescent lights and sharp, sudden pains. James was aware of the frantic voices, the smell of disinfectant, and the growing, dull ache of his ribs. He felt defeat, heavy and cold, settle over him, not because of the physical pain, but because of the controlled smile of the man in the gray suit, the clear sign that the Alliance believed they had won. Meanwhile, back in the chaos of Courtroom 405, silence had returned, but it was an unsettled, furious silence. Judge Foster's face was pale but set, her usual stern composure replaced by a chilling clarity. The security breach had revealed the truth that months of carefully crafted legal arguments could not. These were desperate men fighting for trillions of dollars, and they were willing to spill blood on the floor of a federal courthouse to keep their secret. Daniel Cooper stood trembling, gripping the small metal flash drive James had shielded. His shock quickly transformed into white-hot resolve. He knew what James had risked, and he knew James's final, urgent wish. "Your Honor." Daniel's voice was hoarse. "They did not get the evidence. We must proceed. Now." Judge Foster looked at the remnants of the attack, the broken chairs, the marshal tending to a bleeding arm, the very real bullet holes in the ceiling tiles. She saw the profound violation of the law she was sworn to uphold. She nodded once, sharply, abandoning all previous adherence to standard procedure. "Clear the court of all unauthorized personnel," she instructed the remaining marshals. "The jury will return to their box. We will view the evidence." When the court settled into a semblance of order, Daniel walked to the projector setup. The video began. It was crisp, clear, and damning. The faces of Robert Sinclair, 3 other major energy CEOs, and the prosecutor's chief liaison were all visible around a large, polished table. The audio captured every callous word, every conspiratorial agreement. The plan to sabotage Greenhaven's technology, the bribery of regulators, the coordinated legal assault, and the confirmation that the whole affair was designed to maintain a monopoly. Then came the final gut-wrenching moment. Thomas Cooper, Daniel's own brother, appeared on the screen, detailing the internal plans of Greenhaven, and accepting a heavy financial payoff from Sinclair. He laughed, casual and cruel, about the fallacy of clean energy. The effect on the courtroom was immediate and total. The jury members who had spent weeks watching dry financial testimony now saw the truth laid bare. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The entire structure of lies crafted by William Thornton and his team collapsed into dust. Judge Foster sat motionless for a long time after the video ended. She looked at the faces of the jury, then at the empty table where Thornton's team had been sitting, having abandoned the case immediately following the attack. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low, steady, and heavier than the gavel she gripped. "This court has been made witness to an unprecedented conspiracy, one that has reached into the very foundations of commerce, law enforcement, and this judicial process," she stated, her eyes fixing on Daniel. "The evidence presented is conclusive. The charges against Greenhaven communities are dismissed with prejudice." She did not stop there. She ordered the immediate impounding of the evidence and requested the Federal Bureau of Investigation to commence a broad investigation into the CEOs and corporate entities named in the recording, citing the attack on the courthouse as an act of domestic terrorism. Then she did something no one in that room had ever seen her do. She paused, looking down at the bench, collecting herself. When she looked up, her eyes were slightly wet. "I have witnessed acts of cowardice and betrayal in this room," she said, her voice now aimed at the empty space James usually occupied. "And I have witnessed an act of profound courage and commitment to justice, performed by a man I wrongly judged, repeatedly, based on nothing more than the clothes he wore and the floor he cleaned." Her voice cracked slightly. "Mr. James Wilson," she said, her words echoing the formal dismissal, "I want the record to reflect my deepest, most sincere apology to a man who proved that truth, not title, determines competence. This court thanks him." Across town, James was stabilized, bruised but awake, in a small hospital room. Lauren rushed in, tears streaming down her face, ignoring the protesting nurses. She held the small, battered hand that had gripped the flash drive, feeling the fierce, steady pulse beneath her fingers. "We did it, Dad," she whispered, resting her head on his chest. "We won. Foster dismissed the case. The whole thing is over." James squeezed her hand, a weak, tired smile spreading across his face. He felt the tension that had gripped him for 3 decades finally begin to release. He had his justice, and, more importantly, he had his daughter back. Their reconciliation was complete, forged in the heat of a shared battle. The fallout was swift and brutal. Within 3 weeks, the stock prices of Midwest Energy and its associated companies collapsed. Indictments followed for Robert Sinclair and dozens of co-conspirators. The alliance, once an invisible shadow, was now a public spectacle of corporate criminality. Daniel Cooper visited James as soon as he was released from the hospital. He offered James the position of chief legal officer for Green Haven, a salary James could barely imagine. James listened politely, shaking his head. "Daniel, I appreciate the offer, but that's not my fight anymore." He and Lauren opened the Wilson Law Practice in a small, bustling office on the South Side. They specialized in civil rights and public interest cases, the invisible victims of institutional power. Lauren managed the complex digital forensics and the business, while James brought his unmatched legal mind and street-level understanding of injustice. The Illinois Bar formally reviewed James's case from 3 decades earlier. They found overwhelming evidence of corporate manipulation, coerced testimony, and racial discrimination, engineered by the very forces James had just defeated. James Wilson's record was cleared. The disbarment was officially erased. James remained busy, but every Tuesday and Thursday morning, he still showed up at the Chicago Federal Courthouse in his tan janitor uniform. One Tuesday, he was mopping the marble floor of Courtroom 405. Judge Foster, now deeply changed, stopped by the doorway. She did not wear her robe. She wore a simple suit. "Good morning, James," she said softly. "Morning, Your Honor." He pushed the mop silently. "I received a letter from you this morning," she said. "A simple thank you note. It wasn't necessary." "It was for me, Your Honor," James replied. "Cleaning this floor, staying connected to the people who need help. That's where the real power is. That's what stops men like Sinclair." Foster nodded, understanding completely. She stepped into the cleaned area, paused, and offered a final, respectful smile before leaving James to his work. The celebrated hero, the vindicated lawyer, continued his quiet, meaningful life, ready for the next battle for those who had no voice. What did you think of this story? Now I want you to leave a score from 0 to 10 on what you thought.